This is lecture 8A. We're going to move on to the Mediterranean world. We're going to talk about ancient Greece and Rome today, and there's a lot of stuff to cover here. I don't know if you've noticed, but some of the days have a lot more video than others, but it all evens out to the correct amount in the end. So we're going to talk about ancient Greece and Rome. So the beginnings of Mediterranean civilization, I mean, obviously Egypt is on the Mediterranean, and you had peoples like the Phoenicians in Syria and Lebanon who were on the Mediterranean. But for Greek civilization in the Mediterranean, the beginnings are really maybe 1500 BCE. On the island of Crete, which is one of the bigger islands in the Mediterranean. And this was the Minoan civilization named after King Minos. And Minoan civilization was a trading civilization. They were very good at seafaring. They developed enormous wealth. But they began to suffer some real difficulties with natural disasters like volcanic eruptions and things like that. And the civilization began to go into decline, and it was eventually eclipsed by Mycenaean civilization, which begins on what we would call the mainland of Greece. And Mycenaean civilization would flourish and sort of control much of Greece during this time period. But and I want to just point out that these peoples were probably, at least in part, descended from Indo-Europeans who had moved into Greece about 2200 BCE. So anyway, you have from 1500 to 1100, you have this period of these flourishing civilizations on Crete and then on the mainland Greece. And they develop trade. They develop a real seafaring culture. They develop some nice palaces. Some of the places, some of the palaces on Crete are just amazing. They've got indoor plumbing and even flush toilets. But the period from 1100 to 800 BCE is a period of real chaos on the Greek peninsula. There are a whole series of, we don't have all the details, but we know that kingdoms are rising and falling, the population is dropping, people are leaving. It was a period of a nasty period. But by 800 or so, you start to see a new sort of civilization stabilize on the Greek mainland, and this is the so-called polis era. A polis is it's a city-state, basically. And what happens is you see a whole series of cities emerge: Sparta, Corinth, Athens, etc., on the Greek mainland. And they're not that far apart, but they basically dominate a small region, and they develop trade with the rest of the Mediterranean. Now, one thing I want to point out here is Greece is interesting because it's one of the first major civilizations that we're going to talk about in this class that's not a hydraulic civilization. Okay. Now, India is different, but China and Mesopotamia and Egypt are all hydraulic civilizations. And I talked about with the Wittfogel thesis that hydraulic civilizations also often have a highly centralized government and tend towards bureaucracy, etc. Well, Greece is different. Greece does not need irrigation. They have a Mediterranean climate. Their agriculture, olives and grapes and wheat, etc., works pretty well with just rainfall, etc. And so Greece does not develop a big centralized government. Instead, has a whole series of small city-states. So the city-state era of about 500 years is an era of real prosperity for Greece. The population is growing, leading to colonization, which I'll talk about later. Wealth is increasing, trade is increasing, and so one of the interesting things about this is that it engenders conflict. Okay, the city-states were often in conflict with each other, and then in about 500 BCE, conflict comes from the outside, because basically, when Cyrus the Great founds the Achaemenid Empire, this big Persian empire, he conquers a big chunk of Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, right across from Greece. And that region had a bunch of Greek settlers in it, and they really didn't like being under Persian rule, and so they rebelled. And the Greek city-states, the poli, in Greece, Athens and Corinth and etc., decided to help their Greek brethren on the other side of the Aegean Sea and fight against the Persians. Well, in response, the Persians then decided they had to crush the Greek city-states, so they invade Greece in 500, from 500 to 479, and the Greek city-states get together into a league under the leadership of Athens, who had the best navy, and they form this league, this alliance, and they defeat the Persians. They defeat them soundly at Marathon, and then they defeat them at the Battle of Salamis later, a naval battle, and they hold the Persians off. And so Greece maintains its independence in that way, and the Persians have their own issues. But as soon as the Persian War is over in 479, and the Persians are no longer a threat, this alliance starts to experience tensions. And in particular, what was happening basically was Greece had this enormous navy that they could fight off the Persians with, and so the other city-states would often just give Greece money. Athens had a navy. So the other city-states would give Athens money and just say, outfit your navy, etc. And that was great while the Persians were there as a threat, but when the Persians aren't there, Athens is still like, hey, give us money to build up a navy, and everyone else is like, we don't want that. And Athens is sort of like, hey, we're getting our money, and this turns into a conflict as some city-states want to break away from Athens, some are allies of Athens, and this turns into the Peloponnesian War. And basically in the Peloponnesian War, there are two sides, and they're led by two cities. So on the one side, you have Athens. And Athens is a big cosmopolitan city. It's a fantastic trading city. It's got lots of different nationalities and ethnicities. It's got trade with Egypt and with Syria. It's got trade up into the Black Sea with Russia, as southern Russia, Ukraine, etc. It's got trade with the rest of the Mediterranean. Athens is big and wealthy, and Athens is culturally very sophisticated. They have theater, they have great architecture, they have art, they have scientists, they have philosophers, and I'll talk more about some of that later in this lecture. And Athens is a democracy. Now, it's not a democracy the way we think of in the sense that everybody gets to vote, because women certainly didn't get to vote, and the slaves didn't get to vote, and foreigners didn't get to vote. But Athens had a small subset of the population was male citizens, and they all got to vote and they all got to serve in the government. Right? So that was Athens, and they had a number of allies. And then on the other side, you had a coalition of city-states led by Sparta. And Sparta was a very different thing. Sparta basically was a small city-state that had conquered a number of other city-states. And what Sparta did was the Spartans themselves were citizens, and they were sort of ruling class. And whenever they conquered another city-state, they basically made everybody else what's called a helot, which is that they had to work on farms, and they were sort of independent farmers. Think of a medieval serf, maybe. They were tied to the land. They couldn't leave. They had to work on these farms and provide the excess harvest beyond their needs to the Spartans. And to hold this together, Sparta had developed this military culture. Spartans themselves, all adult men, had to serve in the military. And in fact, boys at the age of 7 were taken from home and put into the military barracks where they were trained in fighting. And they grew up in the barracks. They lived in the barracks until they were 30, at which point they could retire and go have a family. You could actually get married when you were serving in the military, but you couldn't live with your wife and your family. And you had to live in the military barracks. So Sparta has this sort of military culture where every adult male from age 7 until 30 is in the army, living in the barracks, and they're training. And Spartan culture was really, Spartan, that's where we get the word. No luxury. They didn't wear jewelry. You couldn't wear fancy clothes. They ate plain food, etc. But they held together the control of their helots, etc., through this enormous military power. Well, Sparta puts together a coalition of states who don't like Athens, and Athens puts together a coalition of states that don't like Sparta. And the Peloponnesian War is a really nasty fight, and both sides commit atrocities, and it's really a horrific fight. And in the end, Sparta and its coalition wins, right? And Athens loses, and Athens doesn't get destroyed, but it does get its power broken. Well, no sooner has this happened than throughout the 400s, you have a great deal of conflict between city-states, and the Peloponnesian War had really been a nasty thing, so it took Greece a while to recover. And no sooner had it recovered than it gets conquered by another group of Greeks. In the northern part of Greece is a region called Macedonia, and there was a king, a man there, Philip of Macedonia, had developed a far more organized military system, and had made some military innovations that gave him enormous military power. And he realized that Greece, as divided as all these city-states were now because of the Peloponnesian War and the bitterness and the destruction of that, he realized that Greece was ripe for the picking. So he basically invades and conquers Greece by 338 BCE. And he has plans to just use Greece then to go and attack Persia. But he gets assassinated in 336. And his son, Alexander, becomes the king of Macedonia, but also the ruler of Greece. And Alexander picks up where his dad left off. His dad had left him this fantastic military with these new innovative ideas, and Alexander is something of a military genius himself. So he takes those new ideas in that army, and it's really a big army. 48,000 men is a huge army for that time period. He takes it, and he attacks Persia. And he basically goes on a 13-year run. He's 20 years old when he starts in 336. He dies at age 33. But during that 13 years, he basically conquers, he invades, okay, so he starts with Greece, he conquers Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. He invades, he's fighting the Persians here. He invades down into Syria, and then modern-day Palestine, and then he conquers Egypt, and then he conquers Iraq, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and then he invades Persia proper, and then he just keeps going. He takes what we would call today Afghanistan. He gets into India, modern-day Pakistan, and then into India proper, and it looks like he's just going to keep winning and keep going and keep going. But his army basically mutinies in northern India. They said, we're a long way from home. We've been doing this 13 years. We don't want to keep going forever, so we want to go home. And so Alexander agreed to go home. He's going to solidify his empire, but he gets sick and dies rather abruptly. And as we saw with the Persian empires, what happens then is Alexander the Great's huge empire gets broken up into essentially three smaller chunks. Three of Alexander's generals each take a chunk. Antigonus takes Greece and creates the Antigonid Empire. Ptolemy takes Egypt and creates the Ptolemaic Empire. And Seleucus takes Persia and Mesopotamia and creates the Seleucid Empire. And we talked about the Seleucid Empire as one of the Persian empires. So I'm going to stop there. Eventually, the Greece would get absorbed by the Romans, but I'm going to talk about that in a later section of this lecture. So the one other thing I want to talk about with the ancient Greeks is that the Greeks were fantastic at colonization. They were great seafarers. They were great at seamanship. They had fantastic ships. And Greece was producing enormous amounts of wealth and enormous amounts of the population was growing dramatically. Because with all the trade, they could get all the food they needed. And so the population was growing. And so Greece began to experience population pressures as early as the 800s and began to carry out colonization. They basically would send out groups of settlers to elsewhere in the Mediterranean first. And then, elsewhere in Greece, they settled all the islands in the eastern Mediterranean, the Greek islands. And then they moved on to Anatolia, which got them in trouble with the Persians later. But they settled in Sicily. They settled in southern Italy. And then eventually they would settle in France and Spain. And the Greeks just sort of build this series of cities all the way around the Mediterranean. And then they go up into the Black Sea. And they start doing settlements in today what would be called Ukraine or parts of Russia. And so they're expanding in that direction also. And then they expand into Anatolia, as I mentioned, along the Black Sea coast now. And then finally, when Alexander the Great conquers all the way to India, in the wake of that, lots of Greeks begin to move into Persia, Mesopotamia, even modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they start settling there. And so you get these Greek cities and this Greek culture, and they found new cities, and they set up trade networks with Greece, and they bring Greek culture to as far away as Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so this era then is called the Hellenistic era. Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. And so it's this period where Greek culture spreads all the way around the Mediterranean and then all the way across Persia and into India. and down into Egypt. And so Greek culture really sort of expands dramatically with these conquests. But what's kind of interesting is there's really very little long-term Greek empire building, right? I mean, Philip and of Macedon and Alexander build this empire. It falls apart when Alexander dies. But even the Seleucid Empire lasts, a couple hundred years and then gets destroyed by the Parthians. And the Antigonid Empire will last not even a couple hundred years, and get destroyed by the Romans. And the Ptolemaic Empire would get destroyed after a couple hundred years. And so ancient Greece is a story of this fantastic culture spreading everywhere, but it's not the story of building or sustaining big, complex empires the way China or India or Persia is. And one thing historians have suggested is that maybe the fact that Greek culture comes from a place that doesn't require hydraulic agriculture meant that there was very little pressure to create big empires. They could survive as city-states, and so they did, and they thrived on that. But what's kind of interesting about this, then, is that Greek culture turns out to be very different than the cultures of China or India or Persia. And so I want to turn now to talking about Greek culture a little bit, and then we'll come back and talk about Rome, which is an offshoot of Greek civilization, and finish up with that.